sort of as if negating the reality. And I think sort of that really is an interesting physical metaphor for defending poetry against the idea of realism, and sort of trying to even inscribe the poetry into a reality that is nothing but poetic. And the second one is this really, I think that's something that helps in so many situations of in everyday life, the people arguing who ended whose dream first. And I think the idea of the non-Freudian dream is really something that I find very important to stress, that here we see an artist working on a specific conceptual framework that defies the universalist claim of the idea of psychoanalysis as being that's something neutral, that we sort of simply can project on all cultural constellations we can think of. And this, I guess, this is what makes it so convincing that you speak about a form of interculturalism that happens within a society. And this sort of brings me back to some metaphor I tried to suggest in the first session. That is the idea of the polyphonic history. So how do we make the numerous voices heard, not trying to unify them? And I think in the context of discourse about interculturalism, especially as it has evolved since the 1980s, and maybe tomorrow we have time also to get back to that during the roundtable at a certain point. For a very long time, interculturalism seemed to be based on the idea that there are universalist patterns on which we can rely. And much of the intercultural theories sort of were based on post-structuralist, deconstructivist theories, semiotic ideas that sort of were underlying under the assumption how cultures respond to each other. But in recent years, as I sort of said, in the field of theater studies, we saw a couple of different attempts to reconceptualize the idea of the intercultural in different ways. And I would like to introduce two approaches from more or less from the field of theater studies to then suggest a third one that I find sort of most convincing, or at least thought-provoking. In 2010, the American scholar Stephen Greenblatt, sort of who really, with the formulation of New Historicism at the end of the 1970s, gave an important impulse for the development of the humanities, ran a little project which, interestingly enough, he himself did not pick up afterwards. That was the idea of sketching something he called mobility studies. And at the core of this approach was something of a manifesto in which he formulated a couple of approaches in which he tried to grasp what do we need to conceptualize mobility to make it really fruitful for the humanities. And the first thought, I think, is really something we can sort of carry on also to other fields, and that is to take mobility serious in a literal sense of the word. Greenblatt sort of argues against approaches to metaphorize mobility as something that happens as if by itself, as many people thought about interculturalism as something happening by itself. But Greenblatt, in his manifesto, sort of argues for, let's spell out the question that arises when we take mobility in a literal sense serious. What are the routes? What are the streets? What are the sort of conditions under which mobility sort of happens? And according to Greenblatt, this also sort of leads to a different geography, also to a different imagined geography, because he says mobility studies should identify and analyze the contact zones where cultural goods are exchanged. This concept of the contact zone has been around in the humanities for quite a while, but in Greenblatt's proposition, it sort of means to turn away from a concept of purity and homogeneity, but rather to look at those spaces, and here again, together with point one, it really changes our perspective to look at where do these exchanges happen. You might remember that one of the texts sort of we gave in the material for Sunday was Greenblatt's introduction to Shakespearean negotiations, where he defines theater as a social space and as a space for circulation. So I think circulation and exchange is something we need to keep in mind. On a side note, I think Stephen Greenblatt, and to me this is one of the important points in Shakespearean negotiations, is that he does not merely sort of think about theater in an abstract way as a space of circulation, but sort of by suggesting the metaphors of buying and selling and trading, sort of tries to also raise our awareness to the processes by which these encounters and processes of exchange happen. So, in a way, Stephen Greenblatt, in this Manifesto for Mobility Studies from 2010, sort of admonishes us to take interculturalism serious as something that has traces and conditions in the material world and how to conceptualize them. And I think this is a very productive approach. And finally, Greenblatt made an argument that I think has been overlooked in the reception of his suggestions so far, but I think that's very helpful when he argues, I quote, "Mobility studies should analyze the sensation of rootedness. The study of cultural mobility that ignores the allure of the firmly rooted simply misses the point." For quite a while, interculturalism seemed to be the complete opposite and the holistic opposite of an approach of closed cultures. But Greenblatt uses the argument saying, if we start to think about mobility, we also can start to understand how the effect and the allure of rootedness can be staged and produced. And also draws our attention to the procedures by which this kind of rootedness, this kind of also homogeneity, the German word would be Ursprung, das Ursprüngliche, das Reine, sort of how this is produced as an effect of the discourse, but also with material conditions. So here I think Greenblatt makes an argument. I won't lie to you, it hasn't really been picked up in theater studies, but it still is an interesting proposition, and I think something that stays with us. So, how does our concept of history and cultural analysis change if we think about mobility? What happens if we take mobility serious in a literal sense of the word, as something that has a material side and material conditions? Secondly, how does our geography change if we don't think about spaces of purity, of homogeneity, but also about those spaces and the procedures by which exchange happens? And finally, the sense of rootedness or sensation of rootedness, something that is produced ever so often. At about the same time, when Greenblatt formulated the Manifesto for Mobility Studies, Erika Fischer-Lichte opened her research center at the Freie University in Berlin with this broad research concept of interweaving performance cultures. And this sort of came with a claim to present a model that is completely different from any previous figures of thought about interculturalism, sort of by describing this concept of interweaving. The German word is Verflechtung, and it's as obscure as the English is. And I think the part of the success of the research center is the vagueness of its title. But Fischer-Lichte sort of set out to open a new chapter in theater studies by sort of making or bringing to attention the question of performance cultures, aesthetic structures that sort of do not merely interact on a level of interculturalism, as for example Brooke has done in the famous Mahabharata and the subsequent discussion about it, but sort of rather on a subtle level, on a microscopic level of the DNA, sort of these performance cultures sort of mingle and merge into each other. The concept of the interweaving has been discussed and disputed repeatedly in different contexts, but in 2023, Fischer-Lichte presented an additional perspective to that by trying to open the historical perspective to this concept of interweaving, and she did that by subscribing to the idea of entangled history. And she criticizes the current discourse in theater studies about historiography as missing the point about entangled histories. She writes, "It is therefore all the more surprising that the term entangled history seems to be completely absent in these publications. It does not even appear in any of the indexes, even though it has been widely discussed in the field of historical studies since the beginning of the century." And that's sort of the analysis is correct in both parts. It is missing from the discourse, and it also is a concept that in history or historical studies has been widely discussed and presented. And the concept of entangled history was presented to respond to a specific problem. And the problem was, and in theater studies, this would start with the studies of Chris Baum, who makes an argument for global theater history. But Baum sort of comes to the conclusion that global theater history does not happen before the 19th century, when the economic, technological, and political conditions of globalization are given. And entangled history was part of a project to say there has been an intercultural exchange way before the time of the globalization, and entangled history was meant to respond to that. And Erika Fischer-Lichte now says this is something that is related to interweaving, but it is not the same. She argues, I quote, "Although the two concepts of entangled history and interweaving seem closely related, they are by no means interchangeable. While the concept of entangled history denotes a specific genre and methodology of historiographical writing, the concept of interweaving in our case, interweaving performance cultures, focuses on the historical practices and processes themselves." So she tries to sort of differentiate these two projects on two levels. She says entanglement is a question of historical methodology, whereas interweaving is something that happens on the level of the performance itself. And she comes to the conclusion, quote, "While many histories of interweaving focus on exchanges between two performance cultures, interweaving can also take place as a multilateral process, a frequent phenomenon since the beginning of the 20th century at the latest." So she sort of, and here you see what happens if you come at the end of your metaphor. Sort of that entanglement seems to allow only for two partners to entangle, and she tries to describe a multi-sided form of encounter and interaction. And the model she proposes is to combine these two concepts. And she sort of calls out deficit in the existing research structure. In fact, histories of interweaving performance cultures or of intercultural performances are frequently not written as entangled history. Rather, the consequences of processes of interweaving are usually seen in a rather one-sided light. If one looks at the examples Fischer-Lichte discusses, for example, performances by Jesuit missionaries in Japan, or other forms of early modern performances like the English comedians coming to Europe, the problem is that the lens of the interweaving performance cultures seems to be restricted to the context of the aesthetic. She barely sort of is able to open it up to larger contextualizations. For example, the usage of performances as part of diplomatic missions, the connectedness of performances across cultures and societies as part of larger trade networks. So while she suggests that the idea of the entanglement sort of opens up a new historical perspective, at the same time kind of keeps limited or remains limited to the pure aesthetic discourse. And so I would like to present a third model to you, which I think is much more productive, and that is Sanjay Subrahmanyan's concept of connected history. Subrahmanyam has articulated this concept vis-a-vis exactly the discourse about entangled history. And one of Subrahmanyam's criticisms is that entanglement seems to be something that happens by itself, or by accident, or by nature, or by whatever. But Subrahmanyam sort of tries to put to the center of attention the fact how connections are spent. So connected history means to ask, who is making the connection? What is the connection? And what are the conditions of these connections? I think if we follow the idea that theater and performance is not only an isolated part of an aesthetic discourse, but also is part of a larger cultural negotiation, it is Subrahmanyam's idea of connectedness that really helps us to ask the questions about the condition, why and how cultures connect to each other. And in a material way, as Greenblatt has formulated, to take it serious. If Greenblatt says we have to take mobility in a literal sense, Subrahmanyam already has formulated in 1997, we also have to take connectedness in a literal sense. It's not just interculturalism doesn't happen because we lay two books next to each other and miraculously they produce joint ideas. But it is the question, how do these travel from one side to the other? In a more recent publication, Subrahmanyam has made an important addition to this concept of connectedness, and this is what I would like to draw your attention to in particular. He writes, I quote, "Ideas of connected histories are based on the idea that the relations between cultures must be mediated, and that this mediation involves, among other things, the production rather than the mere fact of commensurability. Rather than to posit that visual cultures were either commensurable or incommensurable, we need to focus on the acts that produced commensurability." So if you come from Germany, and if you've ever read any text from the Frankfurt School of Adorno and Horkheimer, you will be most familiar with the term commensurability, because this is what they go on all the time. But Subrahmanyam sort of has a much more mundane and practical vision of the concept in mind. And that is the question, what are the conditions, the material, but also the intellectual and hermeneutic conditions of cultures to connect or not to connect? How does understanding and misunderstanding happen? So when Greenblatt poses the claim, let's take mobility serious in an immediate sense of the word, Subrahmanyam adds that we also have to take the fact of commensurability serious and the production of commensurability. This is something that is produced, it is not a given. And I think this is a major shift from a discourse about interculturalism as we have seen it in the 1980s and 1990s, influenced by post-structuralist theories. Of course, I think it's equally important to focus on this aspect that Subrahmanyam says the relations between cultures must be mediated. And this mediation happens, among other things, through theater and performance. Sometimes these might be artistic performances, sometimes these might be cultural performances, for example, of diplomatic missions, of parades, of presenting goods or whatever. But sort of this act of mediation is really where we as theater and performance scholars come into play. So just to sort of draw your attention, and I think this is something we will hopefully have time tomorrow to look also at some examples in that direction. I think it is important that this could be a formulation of intercultural relations that sort of really doesn't put theater and performance as just one other facet on top of other things, but sort of really helps us understand how theater and performance and media sort of help to articulate the connections between cultures. I would like to briefly introduce, and this is again, you know my soft spot for cliffhangers by now. So this would be my cliffhanger for tomorrow before we sort of then open the floor for questions and discussions. I would like to sort of present briefly two case studies. I hope we can have a look at tomorrow more extensively, but I would like to present it because it might help us to also put these theories to a test on where they are helpful, together with the examples presented by Indu today. So, in the German-speaking discourse, the question of interculturality or interculturalism does arise at the end of the 1970s. By then, Germany has been part of several international initiatives, and an important institution that is really worth looking at is the ITI, the International Theatre Institute, which is the loud sibling of the more sober and serious IFTR, because they were all foundations by the UNESCO at about the same time. And the ITI had propagated a festival that was called Theater der Nation, which happened in 1977 in Hamburg. And out of the experience from the Hamburg festival, the director Ivan Nagel, along with Jürgen Flimm and many other people, conceived of the idea of developing a festival of international theater that would be called Theater der Welt, Theater of the World. So what would be the difference? So whereas Theater der Nation, sort of really sounding like the UNO or from the scratch, would be meant as a sort of showing off of nations, so where theater artists would present their nation, the idea of Theater der Welt was a festival that would be radically curated by single individuals and would present single artists from different cultural backgrounds. So instead of working on this Cold War model of creating a neutral cultural space for nations to encounter, Theater der Welt was meant to be an aesthetic space of experience that sort of would not be measured against the expectations of the political order, but sort of rather as part of an individual discourse. So the first festival of Theater der Welt happened in 1981 in Cologne, and it showed off so different artists like Jérôme Savary, Laurie Anderson, Robert Wilson, Pina Bausch. But it also reveals, and if you look at the sources, it's very evident, it also presented a Katakali ensemble. But we don't know the artists. So it sort of falls short on its own claim, of making international experiences, because they clearly sort of treat some of the performances as traditional folk performances, whereas others appear as individual artists in their own right. If we look at the dramatic tradition in the German-speaking tongue at about the same time, it is that few authors, among them, for example, Heiner Müller, start to think of the global South as sort of as historical reality they would like to capture and grasp in their writing. And I think Heimer's production of Antigone in Calcutta also is partly in line with that. So it would be interesting to put that also in a broader context. Heiner Müller sort of produced a couple of texts, among them The Mission, or his revision of Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus, called Titus Anatomy, Fall of Rome, where he sort of tries to create a voice from the global South. He imagines sort of the global South as a revolutionary force drawing attention to economic inequality, to poverty, to the sort of post-colonial violence of the global system. But he does it, and this is why I use the term ventriloquizing, sort of as a way of his own imagination. I still think these are important texts, and it's worth to look at them. And when Joachim Viehbach, one of the most eminent theater scholars in the GDR, published his book on Heiner Müller, actually it was one of the last books I think published by the GDR in 1990, Viehbach particularly sort of draws attention to the fact that Müller is among the first ones who sort of transposes the idea of the revolution of the political theater to the global south. Sort of that he is one of the first sort of who tries to grasp this into a perspective, but it remains sort of in a way limited to his own writing and all, and his writing is extremely powerful. So if you can get hold of one of these texts, it's really worth reading them. They are very strong, very charismatic, but it is, as you will see, sort of nothing of a dialogue, of an intercultural dialogue. His widow, Brigitte Maria Meyer, produced a film out of the Titus version of Miriam, it's funny sort of that they are called Müller and Meyer, so that's the two most common German last names. And Brigitte Meyer produced a film out of this Titus Andronicus commentary where she tried, at least visually, to open the space of this Shakespearean play to a global perspective. So she had parts of the film sort of shot in Shanghai. She hired a Beijing opera performer. Others were shot in this abstract space with Baroque ornaments. And the film was less a traditional film, but rather a sculpture in its own right. It was a triptych that was meant to be shown on a whole, on the wall of an entire large banquet hall, sort of where the audience would stand in front of the images rather than sitting back in a typical cinema. This, by the way, is Heiner Müller's daughter, who at that point I think was 13 or 14 years old, and she performed the part of Titus' daughter's role, which is sort of interesting because this is one of the most mutilated and vulnerable bodies in the entire Shakespearean cosmos. I hope we can sort of show you clips from that film. We have to overcome some technical difficulties, but that should be dealt with by tomorrow. So Brigitte Meyer, sort of on the one hand, clearly seems to open up the space of collective imagination to images from the global south. But to a certain extent, if we ask about how these pictures are produced, how they sort of are interwoven, it is still sort of an act of her as the single artist who produces this kind of kaleidoscope. Still, I think it's an interesting experiment because she translates this failing state of Rome that Shakespeare describes in Titus Andronicus in terms of a North African village, in terms of China, and also as part of this abstract room. So it really tries to create a polyphony, at least to a certain extent. My second and last example is a performance from 2024. It was the last performance directed by the Cologne head of theater, Stefan Bachmann, and it was called Akin's Traum, Akin's Dream, and it was written by the filmmaker and author Akin Emanuel Schipal. And the entire performance is based on the idea that Akin tries to write a play about the Ottoman Empire. And he does this in a very complex meta-theatrical way where he creates a figure he calls alter ego, who sort of then seems to fall in dreams about the Ottoman Empire, but at the same time sort of has difficulties to grasp this grand history from the perspective of a German Turkish migrant in his conditions. So the description by the Schauspielhaus itself reads as follows, I quote, "Alter Ego doesn't have it easy. He doesn't really succeed in his plan to write a play about the Ottoman Empire. In search of inspiration, he drifts through rundown Gelsenkirchen on his e-scooter. Then a talking half-horse suddenly appears and lets him know that he's the chosen one, the bottleneck for the new story. The dust cloud kicked up by the e-scooter becomes a sandstorm from another world. Alter Ego is drawn into his own story and ends up in the middle of the Ottoman Empire. Between family dynasties and claims to power, Alter Ego reflects the promising rise of an empire that ultimately came to a standstill." This is an interesting enterprise because really the Schauspiel Köln made an effort by hiring a German-Turkish author sort of to make a claim on a part of history that usually is neglected in the German discourse. And the entire performance was in German with Turkish surtitles, which sort of really was a reach out to the Turkish community. Aesthetically, it is interesting, and this is my cliffhanger for tomorrow, because it really was based on the concept, on the one hand, of the empty space. I think that's something we might need to discuss in terms of the genealogy of Peter Brook defining the empty space in 1968 as the quintessential space for modern or postmodern theater. And many of the experiments of intercultural theater are based on this idea of the empty space. And it's a very stylized, sort of syncretic form between choreographies, between figures coming from Tai Chi or yoga, physical figures coming from Tai Chi or yoga, and it really sort of ends up as a mixture about the Ottoman Empire and this precarious situation of the German-Turkish author, sort of who reflects to what extent he's able, for the one hand, to know about a tradition he has not been really grown up in, and B, to communicate it to an audience for whom this history is completely alien. So I think in its promises, but also in its failures, it's an interesting, interesting production that sort of shows the attempts to create a polyphony by sort of making voices audible that otherwise are marginalized or not present. There's only about half a dozen of authors of German-Turkish descent who really are present in this broad German theatrical landscape, but at the same time, aesthetically and conceptually, sort of it really falls short, because for once it's a very musical, it's a very choreographed production, but barely with Turkish music. There's only one Turkish song to be heard. There are no Turkish instruments. It would have been much more daring to have the entire production Turkish with German surtitles, because also the beautiful Turkish language is sort of totally absent from the entire performance. So therefore one asks oneself, is it really an attempt to polyphony, or is it eventually just an interesting woods of mirror, sort of where the audience is caught up in eventually seeing nothing but itself and its own fantasies? It's a cliffhanger because tomorrow I'm going to speak a little bit about the concept of post-dramatic theater, because clearly these attempts are based and sort of rooted in this idea of post-dramatic theater. And I think that sort of would be tomorrow's discussion, to trying to link the specific reformulation of theatrical conventions under this roof of post-dramatic theater and its impact on the discourse about interculturalism. I would leave it at that point and open up for questions, because we have 20 minutes. So, Asta, hang on, you have to wait for them.
I'm interested in this idea of cultural contact zones, which I'm interested in this idea of cultural contact zones and how Greenblatt is approaching it, and also because I'm currently referring to Baum's work looking at how he studied globalization of theater through Bandman at the center. And when you talk about that, it is sort of a one-sided approach, because you're not looking at it multilaterally, because the colonized side, the side of the natives, also is not just at the receiving end. So, of course, he's looking at it specifically in the colonial period, but when Greenblatt talks about it, does he also see how it has evolved post-colonialism during the Cold War and now during the globalization period? Have these cultural contact zones changed? Have the aesthetics which is coming out in theater and performance, have these changed?
So, first of all, to the defense of Chris Baum, he explicitly says he writes the history of cultural circulation within the globalized colonial context. And I think the merit of his study on Bandman really is that he's one of the first who actually has drawn attention to this circuit and how it was built economically and culturally. So I think I'm sort of, while I was criticizing him in passing, I wanted to do him justice to the point of saying, actually, he does what he says he does. So he's not pretending to do something else, but he's very upfront. He's saying, this is what I'm interested in. This is how theater and the condition of globalization sort of evolves and emerges, and the form it takes. Stephen Greenblatt's concept of the contact zone, and the concept of the contact zone precedes Greenblatt. There are sort of earlier works about the idea of the contact zone is first and foremost to shift the center of attention from the cultural epicenters to the marginal zones. And please keep in mind, Greenblatt is first and foremost a Shakespearean, so that he realized that there are more places than London that really marks him as extremely attentive. I think Greenblatt probably would argue that the idea of the contact zone, if we take it literal, means to shift our attention in a much more radical way, away from the protagonists who sort of act with a specific kind of agency, but rather, for example, like the case of Old Delhi in Taking the Horses to Jalebi, sort of taking the space serious and to look who is sort of crisscrossing through this space. And I think that's a very interesting perspective. And to me, this is also a response. I mean, whenever someone quotes Foucault's concept of heterotopia, I feel a little bit awkward, because if you look the sources up at Foucault, it's really a little bit more than 1.5 paragraph that he gives about the concept, but it's so evocative that sort of really this is probably one of the most successful concepts of him ever written, without being very substantial. The idea of the contact zone has a similar direction, I would argue, by saying, let's not look at the spaces of homogeneity, let's not look at the spaces of affirmity, but at those spaces of contestation, of intermingling, and of cultural exchange. And we've talked a lot about in the past days about the question of imaginative geography, sort of how our order of space and spatial interrelations would change if we take that serious. I think a geography that would focus on contact zones would have completely different places in mind, and would it look in the first place than the traditional historiographies that focus on the sense of rootedness. So therefore, I would say Greenblatt, as I said, he himself doesn't really follow up on this idea of mobility studies. Greenblatt does not really have in mind specific cases of colonial or post-colonial cities, but at least he offers, or he draws attention with this focus on spatial structures. He provides the framework that would allow to start to look out for these voices.
I was just thinking if of the term network, and if if you use the term network, is it kind of the same as entangled history, or how does it relate to theater studies?
You were sorry, I didn't get the first one.
Yeah, I was thinking that if we use the word network,
Yeah.
is it also the same as the idea of entangled history, or how does the word network relate to theater studies?
Thank you very much. I think that's a very good question. So network theory sort of has been fairly big in the humanities, partly through Bruno Latour's concept of the actor network theory, which is a very specific kind of formulation of that. The concept of the entangled history, and this is one of the criticisms about the term of entanglement, for example, that Subramaniam has, sort of is a rather vague concept. It doesn't really spell out, in contrast to the network theory, how this entanglement happens. Network theory sort of is a very sort of down-to-earth, very pragmatic form of theory that defines nodes and interrelations, and is in a certain way very structuralistic and hierarchical, which I find also problematic because it assumes a continuity and a stability of constellations that very often doesn't happen, at least not in all periods of history one can think of. So in the early modern period, for example, there can be, and this is when Subramaniam is helpful, there can be points of connection and contact for a while, but that breaks away after a certain protagonist dies or the constellation shifts. So I would argue, I think the thinking about networks is helpful because it sort of reminds us to question how these relations are established and sort of what the nature of them is. But at the same time, it is difficult because it presumes a stability, sort of that in cybernetics works with the cases they work on. But for example, in periods of time when constellations were much more fragile and volatile, it is difficult to catch this volatility. Have I matched your question?
Last question done.
More questions?
One of the comments. Sorry, there's a question online for Indu Didi. So, in light of Nivedita Menon's dismissal of intersectionality as a concept, as well as Meena Gopal and others' critique of her approach, I'm curious to know how Anamika Haksar and others have approached the epistemic and experiential spaces between caste and gender in their work as feminist theatre pedagogues.
Thank you for that question. So this was exactly the point that I was talking about when I was trying to bring in the entire aspect of interculturalism also within the country, to say that is the majoritarian politics, when one talks about an exchange between different intersections, when we talk about, say, Dalit solidarity, or we talk about Black solidarity, does when we talk about things at intersections, do they stand in the sense, does the dominant culture becomes a much more diluted in these kind of intersectional spaces when all of these are able to come together? So when Anamika and even Anuradha Kapoor tries to talk about it, like for example, one of the things that Anuradha would do, and Anamika also does to a certain extent, is this whole idea of use of objects, which has been spoken about, because she would make the attention and the focus of the performative space not as these female bodies which are situated at different intersections to talk about identity per se, but rather would diffuse that identity through those objects, which then becomes center stage and the focus of the gaze. Also, like in Antaryatra, what she does is, in her process, in order to deal with these images of intersections, she will make her actors also reverse roles. So, you know, there was this idea through her process to negotiate these intersections, and not to say that intersectionality, just talking about, say, caste or gender or different positions per se, is bringing a certain kind of equality. And that is what Nivedita Menon also talks about, that the whole idea of intersections is not that if you're able to bring in categories together, then you are talking about equitability or talking about them in equal strain, that the dominant culture has now, you know, been subsumed and there has come a certain kind of balance between the same. So my argument here was that directors like Haksar, directors like Kapoor, they are able to do all that through their processes, through their classroom spaces, through their pedagogy, through different kind of methodology, also creating certain spaces for different ensembles to materialize in real world, you know. Thank you.
What is Nivedita Menon's critique of intersection?
She's saying that it cannot be, she's saying it cannot be seen as this one universal idea to say that when we talk about intersectionality, so a certain kind, all the different categories can be seen at an equal space. So when we talk about, say Dalit identity per se, then but we say, okay, let's situate it in position of gender and class, and we have to look at it in this particular totality, then are we diluting that particular solidarity in the garb of this larger argument of intersectionality? So this is also something that Emile Carrillo, when she talks about power lines and talks about black feminism or talks about this whole idea of black identities, she would bring in a similar argument to say that by bringing all these intersections together, to say that it is opening up a more radical possibility of discussion, then are we not, in a way that doesn't do justice to different sections per se? This is exactly what happened in Ghana when I told you that episode, that these women said that it's easier for like an umbrella term to be used to talk about all these categories, but that individuation or individual identities that are very specific and so important, they somehow get subsumed under this umbrella term. So is there a need to question this particular term too, though it is talking about various intersections?
I have two questions actually. First one, from when Anamika Akhtar returned from USSR, her first play, Antaryatra to Kochi Binale performance and Uchakke, did her performance approach or process change a bit during this time? And my second question is, you was talking about the privilege thing. Anamika Akhtar work with untrained actor or untrained artist? Because that is also privilege. If you get because they will understand. She talk don't drink in her performance Kochi Binale, don't drink water, just take a sip. I mean there are some actor who or artists who are not trained, but they really face these things. Did she work with them ever?
Yeah, thank you. So in Composition on Water, she was not working with untrained actors. In that particular performance, they were trained. But this subject matter has been very close to her. So if you see the progression of number of her performances over the years, we see that she definitely deals with people on the marginal or, periphery positions in society. And she has worked with a lot of untrained actors. In fact, one of the reasons she left drama school was that she felt that within this institutional space, she was not getting that kind of freedom to work with untrained actors. Rather, she had to condition these actors also in a particular linear teleological fashion. So for the movie, this particular movie, she worked with a lot of untrained actors. So many of the actors here were actual inhabitants of Old Delhi, which she brought in. Definitely not the 4 protagonists who she focuses more upon, but everybody who comes therein. Like there is a very interesting sequence when there is this spice seller who comes and tries to extort money from Lal Bihari, the one who raises the red flag. So that seller is actually there. And if you go to Chandni Chowk, you see that he's put that poster with a screenshot of his face because he comes. But she said that, while researching processes, there were people also who reached out to her because they were so curious about her process. So it was not her working with untrained actors alone. People also were reaching out to her, seeing her, this upper class Kashmiri Pandit woman being there almost 7 years. She was researching in Old Delhi. So she said, a lot of them were very interested that what am I doing and wanted to be part of the project. Like many of them could not read and write when they were distributing questionnaires. So she would sit there and talk to them. And during this process, she said that she realized that she could perhaps inhabit many of the frames in the movie with these individuals who are not trained actors. And then she later did a performance with all of them. So that is one. And she also has a theater group where she constantly brings in people who are not actors in her performances, in her performance spaces. And at the present moment, what she's even more actively involved is in conducting workshops. And she does these workshops for different schools, so she travels as much her health permits. But in Bombay, she definitely does these workshops, which are not necessarily for drama school students alone, She works with different groups. So that is something she does. Though, now in terms of evolution of her methodology or dramaturgy, the way one sees reminiscence of Krishna, which was something that before she started teaching, I would say that she definitely, having trained, because see, her pedagogy was such that she had already been trained at National School of Drama. So one of the teachers that she says her primary teacher was Karanth. And then she moves on to Moscow, and then she comes back to teach here. So what one sees is that how, as her productions move, they become more and more non-verbal in the sense of the kind of body movements and different types of performative schools coming into her play. So she would have people who will talk about Stanislavskian method, and she would allow them to explore it in the way they want to explore it. Then the whole idea of physical theater, then the whole idea of, say, dance forms, like I showed you, Russian ballerina, if they want to come in, or somebody wanted to do Kathakali in some of her performances. So what one sees is that more and more her process becomes egalitarian in allowing her actors to bring in their own individuality on stage. In Reminiscence of Krishna, many of her actors were from the Moscow school. So they didn't even understand a lot of the narratives and the stories that she was trying to depict to a larger audience. So she said in that she had to become an authority figure to explain them how to even feel. But I think that she has evolved as a process where she's allowing her actors to become co-creators rather than she herself being the primary creator. I think that becomes even more manifest when you see this movie, which is her last production so far. Though she says now that she doesn't think that she's going to make another movie anytime soon because it took so much out of her and the number of years it took out of her, and she wants to go back to theater. But to include more than 150 people who are non-actors was a very difficult task. And I think it is because of her years of training that she was enabling for all her performers, you know, allowing people to be co-creators. So that is the progress one can see.
Any other?
So the question is, do connected histories then offer different possibilities of histories of those communities that are on the margins, that are forced to establish contact and are also forced to the margins by the virtue of belonging to those spaces or professions that compel them to interface with other cultures, which mainstream cannot afford, which mainstream can afford not to have? How does performance studies study these interfaces?
Thank you very much. That's I think that's a very sort of question right to the point, and I would say absolutely yes. And the example I would give is historical one. So in the first day I spoke about this festival by Murad III in 1582 in Constantinople. And if one looks through the descriptions about the festivities, it's evident that the main performer were Greeks, Armenians, and Jews, apart from other performers that came in from Persia and even some from India. So it's very evident that these groups who were speaking about the Greeks, Armenians, and Jews, were non-Muslim groups within the Ottoman Empire. And sort of the connected history sort of shows the evidence that these groups gained some sort of visibility within the Ottoman Empire. And they were sort of part of this super official festival of Murad III. So they were visible in this context. They were represented in the Tsunami Humayun. But sort of they would kind of fall apart in many classical histories because they would sort of be pushed to the side because they were not sort of representing the political power or the majority. And I think much of also what Indu has shown in her argument is that if we sort of embrace the idea of connected history, it creates an attentiveness for those groups who otherwise sort of don't get represented and don't get accounted for. It's difficult to research them because they very often don't leave, you know, the classical traces like lots of monuments or lots of ego documents. But for sure, it allows us to see sort of more participants than if we follow vague concepts like interculturalism or entangled history, because taking it literal, in the literal sense, as Greenblatt puts it, really makes us to ask, but who was doing it? Who sort of actually conducted it? And I think this is a major admonition for theater and performance history to be more specific, to be more precise, and to develop this attentiveness to categories we usually overlooked. It feels as if we have justly really exhausted all the oxygen and other life energy that has been in the room before. So I take a side glance to Amit, whether we call it a day and regather tomorrow, but